Firstly, is the challenges of democratic consolidation, and secondly, the growing insecurity. This notwithstanding, the region was once hailed as a bastion of democracy. Between 2015 and 2020, there was not a single undemocratic change of power in West Africa, indicative of a period of real stability. Unfortunately, however, since 2020, democracy has rapidly declined in the region. It has seen 6 successful and 2 attempted military takeovers, a pain of seemingly glossing over some of the conditions that degenerate into regime changes. We could say for now that the coup d'etats in Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso, among others, are all indicative of the decline of the state of democracy in the region. They also point to the inability, unwillingness, or incapacity of democratic regimes to equip their militaries to take the fight to the extremists. Distinguished guests, it is worrying that despite efforts by African regional institutions like African Union, ECOWAS, and the international community at institutionalizing democratic governance, the continent is currently facing a democratic reversal. These reversals are characterized by the unwillingness of Africa's multilateral organizations to evenly apply the normative frameworks that member states have voluntarily signed onto. This has regrettably resulted in increasing patterns of endeavors by its political leaders to evade fixed term limits.
Elections, and the National Peace Council and the National Commission on Civic Education are 2 uniquely Ghanaian institutions that could and should be copied around the world. Their efforts ensure that the voice of the Ghanaian people is not only heard but also respected and acted upon. However, as the previous speakers have outlined, we find ourselves at a moment in which democracy's strength is being tested around the world, and especially here in West Africa. In recent years, some parts of West Africa have witnessed a distressing decline in democratic norms and a weakening of democratic institutions. This has been characterized by a resurgence of authoritarian regimes, a rise in violent extremism, pervasive corruption, alarming human rights abuses, discrimination against minorities, restrictions on press freedom and free speech, and a failure to share economic prosperity equitably. These factors not only undermine the fabric of democracy, but also erode trust in the very institutions meant to safeguard it and protect human rights. Those countries that stepped away from democracy are now even less secure than they were before their democratically elected governments were replaced by military juntas. On multiple occasions, we've seen rampant and state-sponsored disinformation used to manufacture narratives and spread false information that undermines elected government. That's not to say that these West African governments were perfect. They weren't. And I think something that's very important to discuss today is the need for consistency in calling out attacks on democracy, not just by soldiers, but by all kinds of people, and by disinformation, and by corruption and discrimination. But the massive onslaught of disinformation has undermined democratically elected governments' mandates and accelerated their downfall and made life for the citizens of those countries more complicated, not less complicated. A study by the African Center for Strategic Studies released earlier this month found that disinformation campaigns in Africa have surged nearly 4-fold just since 2022. They have 189 documented disinformation campaigns in Africa, 19 in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger alone.
I don't think this is what the late Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington would have called a reverse wave of democratic breakdowns, though I must say, if you look at all the coups in West Africa, the military coups, it feels like that. But globally, certainly, there's been a long slump. That's the way I refer to it. 17 years in which levels of freedom and the quality of democracy and the number of democracies, all three of those things, have gradually, steadily, in net terms, with some progress but more regress, been moving in a negative direction. We are in a very volatile period now. It is a period in which there is not apathy. There was just a summit for democracy, as I think Ambassador Palmer referred to in Seoul recently. There are many international networks and organizations. In November of this year, the National Endowment for Democracy will convene maybe its 10th biennial World Assembly of Democracy in Johannesburg. And there continue to be both regional and international democracy networks that sustain the vibrancy, conviction, and solidarity of democracy advocacy and learning and improvement. But there are a lot of hostile and malevolent forces that want to roll back democracy, and it's very important that we understand what they are. So I want to then just stress this, that we must insist on a minimum standard of democracy that involves free and fair elections to determine who rules. And this is not a trivial consideration. If you don't have a reasonably free press, independent electoral administration, and the ability of different individuals and parties to stand and contest for power with neutral electoral administration and fair counting of the vote, the fact that you have periodic multi-party elections does not in itself mean that you have a democracy. And I must say, as someone who's been studying democracy or the aspirations and attempts at it for over 40 years with regard to Nigeria, I'm not sure Nigeria really has ever truly had electoral democracy, though there did seem a brief shining moment in 2015 when, for the first time in the history of the country, an incumbent president was turned out of power in a competitive election, and give Goodluck Jonathan credit for doing what many Nigerian leaders in the past did not do, and that is accepting defeat and leaving power. Strong institutions of accountability and a rule of law with protection for individual rights and minority rights. And when vulnerable minorities are picked on and persecuted because they're different, it may seem that it accords with social norms or religious values, but it's a warning sign for the broader structure of liberal democracy because of two things. One is, and I'll come back to one of these, one is that whenever one minority can be persecuted, other minorities are vulnerable, and ultimately individual rights and the rule of law more broadly are vulnerable. And a liberal democracy is not just a political system, but a social and normative system which includes tolerance for pluralism and for difference in all forms. And secondly, as I'll say, we face a threat now of illiberal populism, of political leaders and movements who feel the need to mobilize support on the basis of some form of collective identity because they don't really have answers to a country's problems and they're not delivering on the conditions for sustainable democracy, political stability, and political legitimacy, which are the inclusive growth and broad justice that Ambassador Palmer spoke about. And it's very important for people to beware of false narratives and the siren songs of some kind of crusade for social purity that targets vulnerable minorities and ultimately puts the entire structure of the rule of law in jeopardy. Finally, I want to precede the next slide by saying the following. And much of the rest of what I have to say depends on this statement or is informed by this statement. And it's something I noted when I really got deeply into studying the dynamics of democracy a long time ago, and it's certainly been sustained by the evidence. There is a very strong relationship between the quality of democracy and the sustainability of democracy. The deeper that democracy is, the more liberal it is in protecting rights for all people, in sustaining a rule of law with an independent judiciary, in controlling corruption and delivering accountability, in having neutral enforcement of the law, and independent institutions, including a legislature that exercises independence from the executive branch, and an executive branch that is held accountable by independent institutions. The higher the quality of democracy, the more resilient it is to failure. And the weaker or thinner, the more shallow the democracy, the less liberal in its protection for individual rights, for the rights of various minorities, for freedom of press and freedom of association, and for neutral and robust enforcement of the law, the more vulnerable that system is to complete breakdown. And most of the democracies we have lost in the last 17 years of the global democratic recession have been democracies of lower quality, democracies that were not, by the characterization of this slide, liberal democracies. And so when a country slides from being a liberal democracy to an illiberal democracy, it's a warning sign that other barriers to democratic erosion may be slipping away and democracy may be in danger.